So, good morning to my fellow panelists and members in the audience. It is my honor to talk to you all today. I thank the South Asian Research Institute for Minorities, SARIM, and special thanks to Dr. Syed Khurram Mehdi for his leadership as a convener and for organizing this panel. Thank you. So, I've been asked to talk about the minorities under siege in South Asia, and there's so much to discuss on this critical topic, and obviously, I commend the organizers for thinking of such an important topic for this discourse. As I was thinking for my talk today, I figured to position it around the few contemporary landmark events that has happened in India, and I'm sure there will be people who will be talking about Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal as we have other speakers. So I'll be focusing more on the Indian aspect here. So when we speak about the minorities under siege, I often ask what the threshold for our community is, where we all sit up and take a notice of the violence, oppression, and or discrimination against the minorities. As Mahatma Gandhi would say, and I quote, "Even if you're a minority of one, the truth is the truth," and unquote. And by that extension, an oppression against one is an oppression against all, and so goes for the discrimination and violence. So now, while I'll be speaking primarily in the context of minorities in India, the irony is that the minorities under siege is a historical as well as universal global phenomena that we see across our different countries where we belong to. We see it often rooted in hypernationalism, in the polarization and divisiveness, and most often it is also on the lines of human constructs such as race, religion, caste, and social class, what have you. So the question that I address in my talk, and I know I have about 10 minutes, I'll be mindful of the time, is how they are under siege. Is there anything we can learn from the history, and what are the fallouts for such an environment? So a couple of few points. The first is that we see that they are under us, minorities can be under siege based on the mindless and thoughtless policies or laws that is brought upon by ruling government, for example, which are not only, like I said, mindless and thoughtless, but also unconstitutional in its core nature. I'll use two examples primarily here, or one to begin with. Some of you may have heard about the Citizenship Amendment Act that the Indian government brought last year. I don't know if I have the ability to share my screen. Do I have the ability to do that? Maybe I can show a couple of slides to explain. Do I have the ability to share my screen? Okay, I can do it. So I'm sharing my screen at this point just to give you a brief glimpse of the Citizenship Amendment Act and how it impacts the minorities in our country. So this is something which the law was brought about in last year in December. It says that any person that belonged to a Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, and Christian community, and it categorically excluded Muslims, Jews, or atheists, who have entered into India from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, so mostly bordering countries, although Afghanistan is not a bordering country to India for that matter here, on or before December 31st, 2014, and who have been residing in India, since 5 years leading up to 2014, which means they should have been technically in India from 2009 and before to qualify for this immunity. They will not be treated as illegal immigrants for the purpose of this act, right? So this is the core of this act that brought about, which impacts the minorities in India, and that's why I'm going to bring in this in that context here. So what if I explain to you in a much simpler terms here? So think about it. There are, let's say, every country has problem with immigration, with illegal immigration or undocumented people, particularly in countries like South Asia. We have, you know, there's, with all the limitations of education, literacy, not everybody will be able to say. And obviously, with the partition happened in 1947, the 1971 happened, with which obviously a lot of people came into the country to seek refuge, and all those things created this issue where we are today. So what this law does, and again, in my legal understanding, I find it as absolutely unconstitutional. It is under, obviously, the Supreme Court is still looking into the cases, but I'll explain to you the simpler ways how we do it. So let's imagine there are undocumented people who are 100 undocumented people, right? We take a stock, they're 100 undocumented. Out of that, there's 60 people who happen to be non-Muslims and 40 people who happens to be Muslims in that group of 100 people sample. Now comes Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, which has been effective since 10th of January of this year 2020. Now, what happens? The 60 undocumented non-Muslim gain the citizenship because they are no more illegal immigrants for the CAA. But what happens is that, and we appreciate that, it's a humanitarian gesture. We should appreciate that. But what happens is, and which is where the problem and the exception of civil society, public intellectuals, academics, scholars, and activists has been. What happens to the 40 undocumented Muslims? They, based on the CAA, they do not get the citizenship, right? Which is where the condemnation comes here. So the government narrative, which is, it says that they mislead people to act to appreciate the act of commission, which is what we say. Okay, they're giving citizenship to different groups, which is we appreciate that. I appreciate that personally speaking. But the counter narrative to that is the civil society wants to remind the government to focus on the act of omission, which is the exclusion of Muslims, Jews, or atheists from the act, and which is what the source of the protests were also. So, bringing it back to the idea of the minority under siege, this is one way where the minorities can be under siege, which is where we say that how the government certain regulations or government laws bring also to that effect here. So this is something that again I'll just go over now. So speaking of that, moving forward in that aspect, are there any historical precedents to that which we see here? Based on the if you look at some of the historical aspects here, the religious test, in the Indian context, right, the minorities got under siege due to CAA most recently, right, particularly. And I want to use the word siege very judiciously, because when we say the word siege, it kind of creates this whole doom and gloom situation. And I don't want people to get that, but I'm just using that word because that's what the title of our talk is. So whatever the problem, the concerns are, so this Indian government used a religious test as a matter of the Citizenship Amendment Act. Are there any precedents to that, right? So this religious text also harks back to the Nuremberg race laws. Some of you who may have known about the German history, that was promulgated almost by Nazis by almost about 85 years ago, which stripped the German Jews of their citizenship, right? And what it culminated into a ghastly, Holocaust where we understand millions of Jews were exterminated. So those are some really, really serious fallouts or outcomes of this minority under siege when we talk about that. Similarly, one can also look for comparisons at the systems of apartheid in South Africa, which what is it did? It legitimized the white supremacy and racial segregation by the virtue of this called Native Land Act of 1913. And what it did was it legitimized the discriminatory foundations of South African law by excluding the black South Africans, which is where we saw that how Nelson Mandela fought his entire life to pretty much shun the apartheid from South Africa. So, and finally, the last reference to that historical backdrop is look at the Israeli Citizenship Act of 2018, which was pretty much where I can see that our Indian citizenship law is pretty much modeled around that concept here. What that law did, they also known as the Jewish Nation State Act, right? Which almost discriminates about nearly 20% of its Arab population, which is the minority in the state of Israel. Now, what they do, which is about 9 million people we're talking about that. What that law does, three things. It says that the right to exercise national self-determination in Israel is unique to the Jewish people. And we see similar narrative now being brought about in India about being a Hindu state. When our foundation is of a very much of a pluralistic, a secular society, secular country since we got independence in 1947. Then it establishes Hebrew as Israel's official language and downgrades Arabic, a language which is widely spoken about by Arab Israelis, which is again a 9 million population we're talking about that, right? So again, so that is something obviously now in India we constantly see a push for making Hindi. And as much as I'm myself a Hindi speaker, but I respect the fact that my country is a secular country, which allows different languages to exist and coexist. But this is where when you see the push for one language, to say this will be the language of the nation, it becomes a little challenging to see that happening. Then also it establishes the Jewish settlement as a national value and mandates the state will labor to encourage and promote its establishment and development. So again, going back to the whole concept of Hindu Rashtra. So this is the historical background of how we see the minorities have been under siege in different countries based on the government laws that are brought about by the government. Uh, what are the fallouts? And I'll be finishing on the next few minutes. I know my 10 minutes are over soon. So what we see as in terms of the fallout is people to people divisions, right? We see that often happening. You know,
I'll take the example of US, for example. In the US also we see the minorities. I won't use the word siege here, but again the polarization that we see, what has happened is that based on the FBI's annual report, US itself has witnessed a rise in the violent hate crimes and threats. And who did it impact the most? Latinos population, the transgender people, or including Jews and the Jewish settlements were being targeted of this hate crime in the US, right? So again, Jewish being the minorities in this country also to whatever degree it is. Similarly, the Indians, even within America, Indians being the minority have also received some hate crime in that aspect. For example, in 2018, Sikhs were officially the third most targeted group of hate crime. Followed by the anti-Hindu hate crime, which has been remaining stagnant at 1%, and about anti-Muslim bias or hate that we have seen is about ranges from 17 to 18% of the statistics what we see. Coming back to the Indian concept of the fallout here, India has also similarly seen rise in the communal rhetoric, which has been made by national leaders, by using different phrases and what have you. And now what it led to almost when we had, in the past 6 years, for example, minorities have been targeted. We understand that. Whether it's cow lynching, mob lynching incidences, whether it's crime against Dalits, we have seen those happen. And just about in the last 6 years, there was a report for the Human Rights Group report which documented about 44 people were killed in the last 6 years based on mob lynching, and out of which about 82% of the victims were Muslims. Right. So now when you see that 82% of the victims happen to be a Muslim, then clearly you see a pattern of impacting of the violence, of oppression, of discrimination, and again these are all fatal incidents we are talking about that. So, and similarly, since 2014, even the Christian minority population, which is about less than a percent or so in India, has also faced increased persecution. Which and there's a organization called Open Door, and based on their annual report, we were about ranked about 30th rank in the world, in terms of religious freedom. But now in the last 7 years, now India has jumped up to the 10th place in the list of countries where Christians suffer, and I quote, extreme persecution. And that's obviously a dangerous trend. Again, we are setting through the minorities. So when we speak about minorities, I want the audience to think about minorities outside the lens of just one religion. It's not just Muslims. It's again anybody who has a less, a social capital also to some extent. To that event, even people in the social class who are in the lower in the cadre, right? Whether economically speaking. So we talked about the CAA. The CAA not only impacts Muslims, we understand that it does obviously, but then it also impacts people, let's say, who are in the Dalit population or tribal population who cannot afford to secure their papers and produce their citizenship, papers and all that. So it is a very universal phenomenon in that process, which we see different groups being targeted. And last point here that I would make before I turn it over is that, what else is promoting this minority under siege concept, right? What adds to that? What adds to it? And what we see is that when media also turns against the minorities, right? So we see that the government is already bringing laws which are against the minorities, which are favoring a certain group or not favoring a certain group for that matter. But then media also does its part. For example, if we talk about the historical precedent first, some of you may have known about the Rwandan genocide in 1994 that happened, which witnessed almost an estimated 1 million death, and it's not a small number, 1 million death almost, with members of the Hutu ethnic majority killing the Tutsis. So there's the two predominant groups here, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Now, Tutsis being the minorities there, a minority ethnic group, right? So what happened? First, people started to dehumanize the Tutsis groups, and where the local media played a part. The local radios, for example, started colluding with the government, up till times, and when they started associating Tutsis as Inanzis, which is translated as cockroaches, as an example, they started to call or as snakes, or calling people to exterminate the cockroaches. So you start to use the dehumanizing language against the minorities, and which is where you start to polarize people. And in many ways, what we saw the 1994 genocide of the Rwanda genocide. We see similar hate mongering in our current political context also, and which is what is amplified by the media. Which is where we want to make sure that when we talk about the minorities under siege, we also take in the role of the media that adds fire, to the fury there. And the last thing I would say is that it's also the people to people. At the end of the day, it is people
Oh,
turning against
wasn't
people.
that?
So we also have to be, smart enough or intelligent enough to understand, when the polarization happens from different groups, from different, political parties, and at the end of the day, we all have to live as a community together. So to that effect, I feel that there is definitely a problem against minorities in different South Asian countries, including in India, which is by the laws. We saw the Kashmir happened, Article 370 happened, which has also brought a lot of human rights violation to that, and obviously the Muslims being the minority in India, it has also impacted our the young children who cannot, let's say, access internet now, right? Because now they can, and the reason the internet is important is because now they cannot get educated. So now, due to those bad laws or those bad policies, we are not only impacting the minorities population from a human rights perspective, and again, education being a part of the human rights, we're also kind of almost pushing the generation behind in that aspect. So those are some opening remarks. I appreciate the time and thank you for listening. I will turn it over back to the convener here. Thank you very much.